It's way cool because, first president in his mouth, it's such a personal thing, right? I mean, it's a denture. It's not like your shoe. It's not like a belt. It's not like a sword. This was in his mouth.
I was there when he was giving speeches.
Yeah, it was probably the reason that, his second inaugural address was the shortest in history, because if you see it, you'll understand that you wouldn't want that in your mouth. It couldn't be comfortable.
Hi, I'm Ayla Sparks, and this is Curator's Choice, a podcast for history nerds and museum lovers. From ancient relics to modern marvels, each episode of the show features a new museum and a curator's choice of some amazing artifacts housed there. These guardians of history will share insights, anecdotes, and the often untold stories that breathe life into the artifacts they protect. Thanks for tuning in to this Mighty Oak Media production, and enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to another episode of Curator's Choice. Today on the show, we take a bite out of history with Scott Swank at the National Museum of Dentistry. Join us as we journey to the heart of Baltimore, where the first dental school took root, revolutionizing oral health care. We'll reveal the pivotal moments that sparked the dire need for dental regulation, from sideshow jaw hackers to educated dentistry professionals. In this episode, we'll hear the captivating truth behind George Washington's dentures, a tale far removed from the myth of wooden chompers and closer to the wild truth of hippopotamus ivory. Join us as we sift through the complex layers of dental history, from the mysteries surrounding the use of teeth from enslaved individuals to oral folklore around the world. So a quick warning for parents listening with young ones. We may be uncovering a few secrets about some childhood traditions, so if you prefer to keep the magic alive for now, you might want to save this episode for grown-up ears only. Without further ado, let's get started. Well, I had no idea that Baltimore was so known for dentistry at all.
First dental school in the world.
That's crazy.
Dental college in the world, yeah, in Baltimore. Davidge Hall, and there were two professors there who were teaching what they called odontology lectures. And the students didn't go. Sometimes they went, sometimes they didn't. The professors thought it was important enough. Yeah, they were kind of ahead of their time, really, with this whole thing about oral health being important to your overall health and that kind of thing. So they thought it was important enough at the time that they petitioned the medical school to create a dental department. And the medical school was going through some really, really hard times. They were arguing with the state of Maryland about who owned everything. They didn't have enough money. How they survived, I really don't know. So they didn't have the wherewithal at the time to put in a dental department. They also didn't have the space. Dentistry was a completely different method of learning, really, at the time. You went to medical school for the lectures and you did your hands-on training at, clinics and hospitals and infirmaries, and those kind of things didn't exist then for dentistry. So they didn't have the space in the medical school to put in the dental facilities for people to learn the hand skills. So they just said no. And the two professors did a petition in the state and got enough signatures to petition the legislature to open a dental college, and the legislature said yeah.
So without having any areas to really practice, it sounds like, how different was dentistry as a profession back when they first started the first dentistry school?
Well, in terms of differences, there were a lot of physicians that were in private practice, and they had small offices, and dentists were the same way. But the medical profession was licensed a long time before the dental profession. And medical schools go back in Europe, forever. You've got Padua and Bologna and Edinburgh and, all those places. So physicians were, professionally trained for a long, long time, but they had all their clinical learning came from hospitals and infirmaries, and those things just didn't exist for dentistry. It was a cottage industry, small private practices. So the students, once the dental college opened, they didn't even have an infirmary themselves for a number of years. So the students would learn in the professor's practices, which is largely how dentistry was learned anyway.
I was wondering if it was like a trade where you just go in and be an apprentice at someone who's already doing it.
You did. They called it preceptorship. And that's the way dentist you didn't have to do that. I mean, you didn't even have to buy the books. I mean, you could buy the instruments if you could find them and just start,
Just start whacking away.
yeah, yanking people's teeth out, basically. And a lot of charlatans did. I mean, there are any number of images, not portraiture, but paintings that depict, you know, this person and they've got an assistant with grinding an organ and they're making all kinds of noise to draw a crowd. And then they get a person from the crowd and they come up and they extract the tooth and they hold it up. And who knows if they had practiced with it, had precepted under another dentist, if they had even read a dental textbook at that time. Who knows? I mean,
It was a lawless wasteland
yeah, it could be.
of showmanship.
And, the reason I had always wondered why the profession kind of started in the mid 1800s. And dentists at that time were starting to form associations, state associations, local associations. They knew the profession had to become professional, basically. So, in order to do that, they knew they needed an organization, which they had been toying with for a while. They needed a journal, and the journal started in 1839. And they knew they needed professional training. And I think the real impetus for that came with the collapse. There was economic collapse in the United States in the late 1830s. So a lot of men were out of work. And apparently, a bunch of them saw people they knew who were practicing dentistry, and they were doing pretty well. And they said, well, heck, I'll just practice dentistry too. And the people that had been practicing dentistry and were doing it correctly had learned, from other dentists and that kind of thing, saw this as a huge problem in terms of whatever you want to call it with the population. I mean, they were, going to see the status of this profession just drop like a rock. And they wanted to take steps to prevent that. So I think that was part of the reason the dental school was founded there as well. Gave that a big impetus. And then, practice laws started early on. The dental school opened in 1840. And I think Alabama had the first practice law in 1841. Of course, all those practice laws, I think pretty much, if not all of them, the vast majority of them grandfathered in people that had been practicing dentistry for years. I think if you didn't have a complaint against you with anybody, you were grandfathered in. But of course, people that were new had to be licensed after, at those points.
Back in the 40s, I am curious, was it just if you had a toothache, you'd go to the doctor and they'd yank that tooth out? Or was it a little bit more like a medical approach?
For a physician, a lot of physicians did dentistry because they had to. There weren't any dentists around. So if they had, a patient that ended up with toothache, they many times took it out themselves. Now, if there was a dentist around, they would have done that. And they had the instruments for it. It was a lot cruder than it is now. And of course, there wasn't any anesthesia.
I was going to say just a jug of whiskey, right?
Well, yeah, I assume alcohol was a big part of it. And tooth extraction was primarily what they did. Dentures didn't really become affordable for the middle class even until the advent of vulcanite as a material to use as a denture base, which is basically cured rubber. And that process was discovered in 1853, I believe. So it wasn't until after that, pretty much, I would say there probably aren't that many vulcanite dentures made pre-Civil War. Then, of course, the Civil War happens and everything kind of goes haywire. And then things settle down after that. So really, dentures didn't really become a thing until after the Civil War, I would say.
Speaking of dentures, you have one from probably the most recognizable person from U.S. history, George Washington's dentures.
I mean, it's way cool because, first president in his mouth, it's such a personal thing. right? I mean, it's a denture. It's not like your shoe. It's not like a belt. It's not like a sword. I mean, this was in his mouth.
I was there when he was giving speeches.
Yeah, it was probably the reason that, his second inaugural address was the shortest in history, because if you see it, you'll understand that you wouldn't want that in your mouth. It couldn't be comfortable.
For his teeth, is it kind of he had one set of dentures that he used throughout his life?
He did
Or were
not.
there there were multiples?
Multiple dentures. We know there are 1, 2, 3, 4. There are 4 dentures, part of a denture, or a denture set extant. So the Royal London Hospital Museum and Archives has 1/2 of one denture. It has been described as half of an upper. I don't believe it. We've got a model of it in the museum, and I think it's half of a lower. The New York Academy of Medicine owns a lower denture, a full lower. It's not, I say full. Technically, it's not a full denture. There's a hole in it that the denture went over Washington's last remaining tooth. So it was what modern dentistry would call an overdenture, but it was basically a full denture. The upper to that set, I don't know what happened. The upper to the set that London owns, have no idea what happened. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association has at Mount Vernon, Washington's estate, they have a full set of dentures. They have an upper and a lower. So that's the third. We have a lower. The upper to that set did exist. We have no idea where it is now because it disappeared. And then it is rumored that Washington was buried with a set. So that would be the 5th set that we know of. And I think there probably were other sets or parts of sets on top of that. Washington was never satisfied with his dentist. He was always complaining about privately about the person, more publicly about the dentures. He utilized at least the services of 8 different dentists. John Greenwood ended up being his favorite in terms of dentures. We believe there may have been a set made for Washington by James Lameilleur, and nobody knows where that set is. And Washington described a set of dentures as being unwieldy, too large, and too clumsy to use. We think that set may have been made by Lameilleur. But once Washington kind of discovered Greenwood, he stuck with him. Like I said, Washington had one remaining tooth. Washington lost that tooth just before he was inaugurated president for the second time. So Greenwood had to make another set, which we think was the London set. And I think it was all one piece. The lower was all one piece of ivory, the base and the teeth. They were not different sections. And I think Washington dropped it and broke it. That's why only half of it exists. So Greenwood had to make another entire set, and that's the set we own.
Rumors kind of abound when it comes to George Washington's teeth because, we've all heard the wooden teeth.
Yeah,
and
never.
They were actually enslaved individuals' teeth, and then that they were ivory teeth. So can you let us know what's going on with these rumors?
Let's go with wood first. No wooden dentures in the United States or Europe. So the people Greenwood was an American and had been trained in the U.S. as a dentist. Some of the other folks had come over from France because France, during that revolutionary time period for the U.S., was the place putting out dentists. I mean, they were dentistry central for Europe at that point. And some of those fellows came over with different groups during the revolution. They were assigned to different military groups or to the Navy on a ship, that kind of thing. And they ended up staying, which is really kind of where U.S. dentistry got its start. So they had no background in wooden dentures. They weren't making wooden dentures in Europe, so they didn't make them here. I think primarily because the actual woods were different. They did make wooden dentures in Japan, but they used a very dense, very oily wood.
I was going to say the wood would swell in your mouth.
I I'm not so sure the oil would help with the swelling, but the splinters,
Oh, yes, that
you could
too.
actually finish it smooth so that it didn't stick you. And I also think that Europe had access to a huge amount of ivory. I think there was just ivory coming out of Africa like you wouldn't believe, and not necessarily elephant ivory that was going into into the fancy trades, but there was a huge amount of hippopotamus ivory coming out of Africa, and that's what they were using primarily in the fabrication of dentures in both Europe and the United States. And you have to understand that dentures at that time were all handmade and hand fitted to a plaster impression. So you had to take a piece of ivory and start carving it and keep fitting and carving. And oh, this spot's too high, I'll carve that. Now this spot's too high, I'll carve that. So, in terms of what a denture cost then, would probably be in the neighborhood of just over $100,000 today. So, only the elite of the elites could afford to have a denture made for them. Now, slave teeth on one of George Washington's denture. I'm not so sure. The New York Academy of Medicine denture has some human teeth on it. I'm not sure any of them would have been from Washington's slaves, for the reason that dentists were acquiring human teeth to use on dentures from various places. And Greenwood made the denture, and Greenwood would have not had access to Washington's slaves. But he would have had access to the population of New York City. And there were a lot of poor, very, very poor people in large metropolitan cities like London, Paris, New York, all those kinds of places. And dentists would actually pay people for their teeth.
Oh, that is so sad.
Yeah, sad story, but true. And you were hoping to get teeth from younger people, females especially, because you wanted teeth that looked good. You
Yeah.
couldn't use a rotten tooth on a denture. You had to use teeth that looked good. So that's primarily where the teeth were coming from.
The dark dentistry trade.
Yeah, where dentists would just pay, or they would keep teeth that you've got to understand that periodontal disease was just as bad as decay at the time. So you're getting teeth that need to be taken out, not because they're decayed, but because there's no bone left to hold them in. So Greenwood had an entire box full of teeth that he could choose from to put on dentures. So I think the chance of the human teeth that are on the New York Academy denture being from Washington slaves is very, very remote. They used a lot of calves' teeth, bovine teeth. They were nice and white. You could carve them easily,
Oh,
especially for like the larger anterior front teeth on the upper. Yeah, you could carve them easily. The teeth that were on our denture they were all ivory. The upper ones used individual pieces of ivory. The lower ones use sections of ivory that are carved to look like individual teeth, but it's actually like, 3 or 4 teeth in a row. And then they they're onto the denture that way. The Mount Vernon denture has all kinds of stuff on it. It has what one person thinks is an elk's tooth used as one of the molars.
Because elk do have ivory in there.
Elk have vestigial tusk. Yeah, they call it elk ivories. Yeah. And one of the teeth came off and it was repaired, and the repair was made with a nut. Yeah. I don't know what kind of
Like a
nut it is.
chestnut or
Yeah. I don't have
walnut?
any idea, but it's got a couple X's in it and it's in one of the posterior teeth. So yeah. So that denture's got all kinds of stuff on it.
So, if someone were to come and visit the museum, what can they expect to see? What kind of exhibits do you guys have?
Well, the exhibits at the Dental Museum kind of run the gamut. I mean, it starts out with teeth in popular culture, because we were really trying to get away from that whole idea of dentistry and pain. Those two have been associated for way too long. And so the first part of the museum talks about teeth in popular culture, different cultural traditions with teeth, smiles, toys, films, commercials, that kind of thing. And then it goes into prevention. We got information on fluoride when that first came out and the controversy, the big controversy
Hmm.
about putting fluoride in water and that kind of thing. Got Queen Victoria's dental instruments.
Oh, wow.
During the Victorian era, if you were wealthy enough, you had your own personal dental scalers that you took to the dentist, who then used them to scale your teeth, as opposed to the scalers he owned or she owned, mostly he, that he owned to scale teeth so that you weren't having your teeth scaled by instruments that had scaled somebody else's teeth, which at the time probably wasn't the worst idea in the world. I mean, we assumed that the instruments were being cleaned. I don't think there was really nothing antiseptic going on. I mean, there wasn't even anything antiseptic going on at that time in hospitals.
You probably just wiped off on the apron and then
Yeah,
next
that kind of
patient.
thing. Yeah. So if you could afford your own, you took them. So of course, Queen Victoria could afford her own. So she had her own.
I'm sure they were gold encrusted or
They're quite
something.
fancy. They're plated silver, gold plated silver with mother of pearl handles. Quite nice. I've seen a fancier set, pictures of a fancier set. Apparently, one of the queens of Spain had a very similar set, but on the crowns, each of Queen Victoria's has a crown at the end of the handle. And where there would be gems on a real crown are just, like bumps in the gold. Whereas the Spanish queen had little teeny tiny pieces of gemstones put there, like sapphires and rubies and that kind of thing. So,
I was slightly hoping it was gonna be the bones of conquered foes, but
yeah, no, I
the
don't
the
think
teeth
so.
of
But
conquered foes.
But so we've got Queen and Prince Albert's personal dental scalers were just up for auction not long ago. Yeah, that was something we didn't have the funds to bid on, but it would kind of been nice to have them both together. And
Yeah.
his weren't as fancy as hers. So
I'm also curious, in your opinion, over the course of dentistry in its entirety, what are some of the most influential or important either discoveries or inventions have been made that kind of revolutionized the dentistry game?
well, dentistry for a long, long time was basically extractions. Now you go back to the late 1700s, and things are getting more complicated in terms of extractions, fillings, dentures, surgeries to remove different things, even to deal with some periodontal disease. But the things and the instrumentation was relatively simple. So you really have to get into almost a more modern time to really see things that revolutionized dentistry. I mean, anesthesia, of course, revolutionized dentistry, and general anesthesia in terms of ether, nitrous oxide, chloroform. They all nitrous oxide was first in 1842. Then you had ether in 1844, and chloroform came right close to that, maybe another 2 or 4 years after that. That's extremely important. But other than, taking out teeth that are difficult to get out, you really don't want to put people out with ether and chloroform. They're dangerous, especially ether, in terms of the transition from being unconscious to non-breathing and dead is very small with ether, which is why chloroform took over, as soon as they showed that it would work. But local anesthesia isn't discovered and proven until 1895. So that's, like 50 years before you get local anesthesia, which is what dentistry revolves around today. I mean, right? So you've got local anesthesia in 1895. And then in the early 1900s, Dr. G.V. Black perfected the formulation for dental amalgam. And that revolutionized restorative dentistry in terms of being able to cut a tooth so that you get out all the decay and then fill it with a material that's going to last a while and isn't injurious, that kind of thing. And the problem with early silver amalgams was upon setting, getting hard, they expanded instead of shrunk. So you were having these charlatan guys going around and they would they weren't even really taking the decay out of teeth. If a tooth had a hole in it, they would mix up this, silver paste and put it in a tooth. And they would be in, a city this week and gone the next. And by the time the fillings had set and expanded and cracked the tooth and made it worse than it was before they started,
Oh.
they were gone.
Yeah.
So, the scientific formulation for amalgam coming out in the early 1900s revolutionized that part of dentistry. And then handpieces. The first rotary driven handpiece that was commercially available didn't come out until like 1877. So before that, if you wanted to put a hole in a tooth or take decay out of a tooth, they had come up with all kinds of mechanical means to do that. None of them really worked that well.
I'm picturing those old egg beaters.
They
where you
did
just
do that. Yep, we've got one of those at the museum. They came up with a clock mechanism. You wind it up, and the spring, turned the burr. That was really heavy. That didn't work well. Bow drills,
Oh,
like you've seen,
naked and afraid where they're
yeah,
trying to.
exactly. And you trying to start a fire with them.
Yeah.
Well, they used those to put,
Oof. It sounds very
preparations in teeth.
precise.
They're difficult to use, of course, and you can't get them, they're very hard to use in the back teeth. So the foot treadle dental engine that had a handpiece with a small burr that you actually made move with your foot revolutionized dentistry. That made cutting teeth. I mean, the time savings and ability to cut tooth was just remarkable.
Oh, that's cool too. Is there anywhere in the museum that you touch on the tooth fairy?
We used to. We put in a big exhibit. We changed exhibits years ago. We took out the information on the tooth fairy. And then we had another exhibit that was an exhibit basically on children's dental literature. But of course, that had books and things on tooth traditions for children, and that included the tooth fairy. But the tooth fairy is just an English thing.
So the tooth fairy is particularly popular in Western folklore, but it is not very well documented as the true origins. However, one of the earliest references to a tooth deity, similar to the tooth fairy, can be found in Norse mythology. So in Norse culture, children would offer their lost baby teeth to the Norse god Odin, and it was believed that Odin would then bless the children in return for their teeth. There are many other tooth traditions throughout the world. Like in most Hispanic countries, there's a small mouse who comes and takes your teeth and leaves candies. In Asia, especially in Japan, there's a tradition where if your child loses an upper tooth, then you're supposed to throw the tooth somewhere on the ground. If they lose a bottom tooth, you're supposed to throw them somewhere high, like up on a roof. And the reasoning behind that is whatever direction you throw that tooth is the direction it's going to grow in. So if you want them to have nice straight teeth, you would do the top ones should grow straight down on the floor, vice versa with the roof. So at the risk of showing off how macabre my mother and I were while I was growing up, I have all of my baby teeth, and I even have my adult teeth that have been removed, like my wisdom teeth. I've kept them all. I was even able to keep some of my puppy's baby teeth, which was remarkable to find. I was lucky enough to find them on the floor. But when I was telling this to Scott, he told me that I am not the only one. He discovered that some scientists are actually doing the same thing, but perhaps for a much nobler reason. Here's Scott.
But now the bioengineering exhibit, I don't know if it brings this out specifically, but while we were doing that exhibit, it came up that they're working on the ability to use semi-differentiated stem cells. So not pluripotent stem cells that you would obtain from an embryo, but there are other stem cells in the body that are what they call semi-differentiated. So for teeth, there are stem cells that will produce any kind of tooth. I mean, you can't get an entire organism out of them, but they'll produce a tooth. So scientists have been working on the ability to grow teeth from these partially differentiated stem cells.
Wow.
And you can get them from baby teeth,
That is incredible.
especially baby teeth molars.
So this is making me sound actually more of a scientist than a crazy person who saved all of my teeth.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
I'm really
So
thinking ahead, actually.
way ahead of the time. And I did not read in putting that exhibit together. I didn't read anything about longevity. So in terms of and how you would have to store those teeth. But yeah, they said that the science may be one day where you actually save those teeth on purpose. And then if you lose a tooth for some reason, perhaps you'll be able to use stem cells obtained from those teeth to grow a new one.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Wow.
Right? That would be the ultimate tooth replacement, is if you could replace your own teeth with your own teeth.
Well, I have learned a lot about dentistry that I had no idea about. Some really dark things, some really exciting and new things. So thank you so much for meeting with me, Scott, and sharing the Museum of Dentistry.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Curator's Choice, a Mighty Oak Media production. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and rating the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you love a museum and would like to hear it featured in an episode, shoot me a message at curatorschoicepodcast@gmail.com. I'll do my best to reach out and see if I can get them to be on the show. You can also view articles, artifacts, and more by following us on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for listening to Curator's Choice, a podcast for history nerds and museum lovers.